Okay, we want to talk about lights within Vizrt T5, and in particular we want to talk about lighting scenes within the Viz engine renderer. Now we just want to do a general overview of the lights, and then we'll do a deep dive into each specific light. So we want to open up that scene that we were working on before, where we built our 3D environment that we could light. So we have a couple of elements within our scene here. We have a text element that we worked on. We have a 3D object within our scene here, which we have a cogwheel, and we also have another geometry that we imported. This is our 3D environment here, and when we are working within the Viz engine renderer, we have this option for a default lighting scene, and you can see when I turn this on and off, it affects the scene here. There are default lights that we can use to default light this. Now, if we wanted to add our own lights, we just make sure that this lighting is off, and we can come in and start adding some lights here. I'm going to turn our cogwheel on just so that we have something to light. And lights within Vizrt T5 use this plugin called Light V4. And to get it on a container or to start using a light, we can just add a group by clicking and dragging it, or just clicking on it and it will add a group. And let's rename this. We'll call this light, and what we need to do is come into our container plugins and you can type in light, and then light v4 comes up. So we need to take this plugin and drag it onto our container, and when we do that, you see immediately that we get this light here. So we're going to click on that little light icon on our container, and it takes us into our light settings. First thing that we have is an option here for our 4 different kind of lights. We have a point light, we have a directional light, we have a spotlight, and we have an area light. As we switch through here, you can see that some of the settings change per light, so just be aware of that, but there are some general settings for each light. I'm going to keep our light on directional, and underneath one for each light we have a color. We can click on this and we have the same color wheel that we have for throughout Vizrt. So we could pick or choose a color that we want to add to the light. If you want to add any type of color, you just use the color wheel. Your variables down here, the HSV, RGB, you have your picker that you can use. If you just wanted to keep it general at white as well, you can. We also have an intensity that we increase or take down to 0. So it goes all the way up past 100, and you can see how that affects the scene as you increase your intensity of this. Again, everything is blue here once you change it. If you want to get it back to the default setting, you just click on that blue setting and it will click it back to the default setting. There's also a diffuse intensity as well. We can increase that up way past 100 or take it down to 0. We have a specular intensity for this particular light as well. And when we change it, we'll get different options for our other lights covered in their specific lights. Now, every light also has this option down here called Enable Shadows, and if you want to have shadows enabled in your scene design, then you need to have this Enable Shadows on for that particular light. More so, each light has its own set of unique characteristics. For example, our directional light, the position and or scaling will have no effect on the light. However, when we rotate it, this is when you'll see what the directional light actually is. As we rotate it around either on the X or the Y, you'll be able to see what the light is doing. And again, you can go back into your diffuse intensity and or intensity, increase it, decrease it if you need to see it a little bit more. Again, we'll go back into our rotation for this particular light, and you can see as we start rotating things here how the light is affecting it. Again, keep in mind your intensity within your scene settings. You also have this intensity setting within our environment map. If we decrease this down, you're going to rely more on your lighting within the container than within the scene here. So we'll just keep that around 50%. Now, one thing you do notice with this light is that there are no shadows currently. Even though we enabled the shadows button here, the rest of our scene does not have any shadows in it. And that's because we'll need to use what's called a caster and receiver to cast shadows and receive shadows. So obviously we would want to use this cogwheel to cast a shadow. So what we can do is drag a caster up onto that cogwheel. If you wanted to also possibly receive lights, if you had other things within the scene that may cast shadows upon that cogwheel, we could use the receiver as well. So we'll drag that on there. Also, since we have a floor here, we want to receive shadows on that floor. And I'm going to drag a receiver up onto the floor. Now, since the floor probably isn't going to cast shadow upon anything else, we're not going to use a caster on that. Next, we would come down to adjust our light. And since the position and scaling doesn't have any effect on this particular light, the directional light, we need to use our rotation. And as we come down and start rotating our light here, you can see that shadow of the cogwheel. Here it's hitting the back wall. As we rotate it here, that shadow is underneath it. So if you're not getting shadows, there's a couple of things you can check. Number one, you go into your lights, and make sure that Enable Shadows is on. You can go into your scene and you can adjust your intensity. Perhaps your intensity is a little bit too high and you're not seeing the shadows within the scene. Also, we can go into the render settings, and under shadow mapping, there is an enable button. So if we turn that off, our shadow disappears, but when we turn it on, we have a shadow. Now also, if you don't see your shadow within your floor or wall, there's something else that you can check. And in this case, we're going to check the floor. Since the floor was a 2D object, there's a chance that when you rotate your rectangle, if it wasn't rotated correctly on the proper side, you may not see your shadows. So, for example, our rectangle is 2D, and if we were to rotate that around, we would not see the back side of it without an expert plugin. So we would need to have an expert plugin on it with the back face with two-sided lighting on. And as we rotate our rectangle around, one side we can see the shadow, the other side we cannot see the shadow. So just make sure that your faces are facing the correct way. In this case, one is 90, the other is -90. So just make sure that if it is a 2D object and you have a receiver on it, that it is receiving it on the front face of that object. Now the caster and receiver plugins have its own set of options as well, as far as adjusting the alpha of the shadow and where the shadows can show up as far as the layers, and you can check out the caster and receiver plugins video for that.